Okay, now I'm going to walk you through writing the legislation story. Our legislation story is going to take on a three-part structure. The first part is going to be the lead. That's going to be followed by an explanation of what the legislation is, why the sponsors decided to write this legislation, and what they expect to happen with it. And the final part of the legislation story is going to be an interview with other delegates, basically to get their opinion about it. So your story will take on three basic parts. The lead, which is a one-sentence statement stating what the legislation is, followed by a bunch of quotations and statements from the bill sponsors about what the legislation is and what they hope to accomplish with it, and finally a couple, two or three quotations from delegates saying where they stand on the issue. Okay, format for writing. The first sentence is the lead, and it's usually just one sentence. Occasionally it's two, but in this case, I'd like you to make it one. Okay, it's the major focus of your article, and it's going to state what the main point of the article is. You should include in the lead the group name who's sponsoring the bill. So, for instance, if it's a group from Lake Park, you would say a delegation from Elmhurst Lake Park is proposing legislation 2, and whatever that legislation is, you would include it at that point. You should also, as you're writing the article, adhere to what we call the paraphrase quote rule. You introduce a quotation by kind of paraphrasing or giving information about the quotation, followed by a quotation. For instance, in the article to the right, if you look at the second paragraph, it says, since this is her first year in the Youth and Government program, she was not sure what to expect. She said, I was very surprised to discover that this program is so organized. Everyone follows the strict schedules, yada yada. If you notice that the statement prior to the quotation introduces the quotation. You want to follow this practice when you're writing your legislation story. You always want to introduce the quote you're going to follow the introduction with. Secondly, whenever you quote somebody, you need to identify them the first time with their full name, followed by their YMCA and their high school, and you also need to include the job that they perform in the program. We went through this earlier. Please make sure that you adhere to this when you are writing your stories. A couple other quick formatting things. Always get more quotations than you're going to use. Okay, when you're interviewing the sponsors, please make sure that you get a lot of statements from them. When you're interviewing other delegates about the legislation, get a good representative sample. Look for different genders, different parts of the state, different years in school, so we're getting a diverse group. Okay, when you write your story, if you notice, paragraphs should be short, 1 to 2 sentence paragraphs at most, and you should always let your quotations do the talking. Introduce a quote, give a quote. Introduce a quote, give a quote. And in all the stories that you're going to write, Youth and Government is always abbreviated YNG. It's just an accepted abbreviation that we use. Now you notice the next part has a legislation story with comments. I'm going to walk you through these basic comments that I have here. The lead, if you notice, says the Elmhurst Lake Park delegation introduced a transcendental meditation bill designed to help reform prisoners. That's the lead. It just states what the legislation is. It introduces the group. Now that you introduce the group and you talk about the bill sponsors, you do not have to state they're from Elmhurst Lake Park because you stated that the bill group was from Elmhurst Lake Park, so you don't have to keep restating that. The next statement explains what transcendental meditation is, and then there's a quote from the bill sponsor. So if you notice, it's always going to be a paraphrase and then a quote. Later down the article, you'll see where it says, according to the bill brief, surveys from the Joliet State Penitentiary. You can quote the bill brief. When you quote the bill brief, you want to introduce it with a phrase saying, according to the bill brief, or something similar to that, so the readers know that what you're quoting there comes from the bill brief itself and isn't a statement made by somebody, but it is actually directly quoted from the bill brief. That's why it's very important for you to get a copy of the bill brief. The other thing you notice is after you quote the person the first time and give their full name, after that it is always last name. Okay, so full name first time, after that it's a last name. And if you notice at the end, there is a comment by a lobbyist, okay, who's making a statement. This particular writer did not get a lot of quotations from other delegates, kind of ended the article with one quotation from somebody besides the bill sponsor. But it's effective, but I would ask you if you can try to get more than just one quotation at the end to give a sense of what the legislation is going to do, when it gets out there. What are people going to think of it, and so on. Okay, so what you're going to need for pre-leg 2, now after you have your legislation story, you're going to have to bring 3 copies of your revised non-candidate interview story. I will revise those and email those back to you. You will then make those revisions, print out 3 copies, and bring those with you at pre-leg 2. I also ask that you email me a copy of the revised one. You also need to bring 3 copies of this legislation story you're going to write. You do not have to write the legislation story today. You just need to have the legislation story written for pre-leg 2. So make sure you leave today with all the information to write the legislation story. Make sure you have the bill brief, make sure you have your quotations, make sure you talk to enough people. Remember that your legislation story, the 3 parts, you state the lead, what the legislation is and who's proposing it. Then there's a big chunk of your article describing why they chose this, what they hope to accomplish with this, and that's all done by the bill sponsors, the lobbyist, and the bill brief. And then your 3rd part is a reaction from other delegates on what they think the legislation is going to accomplish. Now, as I stated in multiple times throughout emails and such, if you have any questions during pre-leg 1, please do not hesitate to contact me. I'm going to be checking my email and checking those texts regularly, so please feel free to do that. Also, I ask you to send me a text or send me an email just saying everything's okay if it's okay, so I know you're at least making progress and that you're not stuck. I wish you the best of luck, and I look forward to seeing and working with you during pre-leg 2 and during the weekend.